September 1972, the monsoon season hung over North Vietnam like a heavy curtain of moisture and violence. At a small concealed airfield near Hanoi, Colonel Mikhail Andrei Volkov stood before something that should not have existed on communist soil. An American Boeing B-52D Stratofortress, tail number 56-0676. The aircraft had landed there 3 weeks earlier under circumstances so classified that even the Soviet High Command pretended ignorance. It was one of the most improbable intelligence coups of the Cold War. A functional American strategic bomber, intact, delivered by a combination of mechanical failure, desperate ingenuity, and extraordinary luck. The operation's code name was Operation Crochet, Gerfalcon. Officially, it never happened. Volkov had flown almost everything in the Soviet inventory: the Tu-95 Bear, Tu-16 Badger, the experimental Tu-22 Blinder. He knew Soviet engineering, robust, utilitarian, designed for survival in Siberian winters and Third World deserts. The B-52, on the other hand, represented everything the Soviet Union was not: vast, intricate, impossibly expensive. It was a machine built by a nation drowning in resources, confidence, and technological hubris. "This is the American god of war," his political officer had said during the initial briefing. 8 engines, nuclear payload capacity, intercontinental range. This machine can destroy continents, and now it is ours to understand. Volkov said nothing then, but standing beneath the enormous swept wings now, under the humid Vietnamese sky, he felt something close to awe. The B-52 was not beautiful. It was monumental. Where Soviet bombers looked like flying fortresses, blunt, armored, aggressive, the B-52 looked like an industrial cathedral, a monument to American excess and ambition. The capture. The story began 3 weeks earlier, on the night of September 8th, during Operation Linebacker 2. A flight of B-52s from Andersen Air Force Base, Guam, had been tasked with striking rail yards outside Hanoi. The mission was routine, if anything involving flying a 390,000-pound bomber through one of the most heavily defended airspaces in history could be called routine. Tail number 56-0676, call sign Copper King 2, was piloted by Major Daniel Wright, a 34-year-old career officer with over 2,000 flight hours. His co-pilot was First Lieutenant Kevin Marshall. 4 other crew members manned the bomber: navigator, radar navigator, electronic warfare officer, and tail gunner. They had flown this route before. They knew the drill: high altitude, precision radar bombing, electronic countermeasures to jam surface-to-air missiles, and a rapid egress back toward the safety of the Gulf of Tonkin. But on this night, everything went wrong. At 31,000 feet, somewhere over Nguyen province, a Soviet-made SA-2 guideline missile detonated close enough to shred the B-52's hydraulics, sever fuel lines, and cripple 2 of its 8 engines. The aircraft shuddered violently. Alarms screamed. Fire warning lights blazed red across the instrument panel. "Copper King 2 is hit, losing altitude." Wright's voice crackled over the radio, tense but controlled. Bail out," came the reply from the airborne command post. But Wright didn't bail out. He looked at his instruments. 2 engines gone, hydraulics failing, but 6 engines still screaming. The aircraft was still flying. Barely. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We're not punching out over Hanoi," he said to Marshall. "I'm putting her down." Marshall stared at him. "Down where?" Wright pointed to a faint line on the radar scope, a long, narrow feature that intelligence had identified as a possible emergency airstrip built by the North Vietnamese for MiG operations. It was insane. It was suicidal. But it was the only option that didn't involve ejecting into enemy territory. "Hold on," Wright said. The descent was brutal. The B-52 dropped through layers of cloud, engines howling unevenly, wings flexing under uneven thrust. At 5,000 feet, Wright spotted it. A narrow strip of concrete carved out of jungle, barely lit. He had one chance. He brought the massive bomber down with the precision of a surgeon, throttles pulled back, nose high, praying the landing gear would hold. The B-52 struck the runway hard, bounced once, twice, then rolled forward with a deafening roar of tortured metal. Concrete cracked beneath the weight. The aircraft skidded sideways, engines screaming, until finally it shuddered to a halt at the end of the strip, intact. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the jungle exploded with motion. North Vietnamese soldiers poured from the tree line. Weapons raised, shouting. Wright and his crew were pulled from the aircraft at gunpoint, dazed, bleeding, unable to believe they were alive. Within hours, the bomber was covered with camouflage netting. Within days, Soviet advisors arrived. Within 2 weeks, Colonel Mikhail Volkov was standing beneath it, orders in hand. Fly it, understand it, and extract every secret it holds. The first inspection. Volkov walked slowly around the aircraft, accompanied by a team of Soviet engineers and Vietnamese officers. Every step revealed new marvels and contradictions. The B-52 was enormous, 159 feet long, 185-foot wingspan, tall as a 3-story building. Its 8 Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engines hung in 4 pods beneath the wings, each one capable of producing 13,750 pounds of thrust. Together, they could push this 185,000-pound monster to over 650 miles per hour at altitude and keep it flying for over 8,000 miles without refueling. "It is an airborne city," one engineer muttered in Russian. But what struck Volkov most was not the size. It was the philosophy. The Soviets designed bombers to survive. Armor, redundancy, brute simplicity. The B-52 was designed to dominate. It assumed air superiority, unlimited logistics, and a technological advantage so vast that complexity didn't matter. Inside the cockpit, Volkov felt as though he had entered a temple of American engineering. Gauges covered every surface. Switches, dials, levers, circuit breakers, hundreds of them. The control yoke was massive. The instrument panel stretched across the entire width of the cockpit, a bewildering array of systems: autopilot, terrain-following radar, bombing computers, electronic countermeasures, fuel management systems, engine monitors, navigation aids. "How many men does it take to fly this?" a Vietnamese officer asked. 6, Volkov replied. "Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radar navigator, electronic warfare officer, tail gunner." 6 men to drop bombs? Volkov nodded. The Americans believe in specialization, every man a master of one system. He thought of the Tu-16, which required a crew of 6 as well, but each man doubled as a backup for another. The B-52 crew had no such flexibility. Each position was irreplaceable, a single point of failure wrapped in technological brilliance. Over the next days, Soviet engineers dissected the bomber with methodical precision. They cataloged every system, every component, every design choice. They found contradictions everywhere. The airframe was surprisingly fragile. Thin aluminum skin, lightweight structure, a single heavy-caliber bullet could puncture it. Soviet bombers were armored. The B-52 relied on altitude and speed to avoid threats. The fuel system was brilliantly complex, with cross-feed valves allowing fuel to be transferred between tanks to balance weight during flight. Soviet bombers had simpler systems, but the B-52s allowed it to fly farther and more efficiently. The bombing system was a marvel, a radar capable of mapping terrain from 40,000 feet, a computer that calculated wind, altitude, speed, and trajectory to drop bombs with terrifying accuracy. Soviet systems required visual targeting or radio guidance from the ground. The B-52 could bomb through clouds at night with precision. But the maintenance requirements were staggering. The engineers estimated that keeping this single aircraft operational required a ground crew of 30 specialists, spare parts flown from halfway across the world, and diagnostic equipment that weighed more than a small car. "This is not a weapon," one engineer said. "It is a logistics exercise." Volkov disagreed. "No," he said, "it is a symbol. The Americans built this because they could, because they wanted the world to see what they could build. It is not practical. It is a statement. Preparation for flight." 3 weeks after the capture, Moscow sent orders. The aircraft was to be flown. Volkov was given command. His crew would consist of Soviet pilots trained on captured American aircraft, engineers who had spent weeks studying the manuals, and a single American prisoner, Major Daniel Wright, who would serve as advisor under duress. Wright was brought to the airfield under guard, gaunt and exhausted. He stared at the B-52, his aircraft now painted with red stars on the tail. "You're going to kill yourselves," he said flatly when Volkov explained the plan. "Perhaps," Volkov replied, "or perhaps we will learn what makes this machine so feared." Wright shook his head. "You don't understand. This isn't like your bombers. Everything is connected. One mistake and the whole system collapses." "Then you will help us not make mistakes." Wright laughed bitterly. "You think I'm going to help you steal my country's secrets?" Volkov's expression didn't change. "I think you will help us because you do not want to see your crew die when this aircraft crashes because we did not understand it." Wright said nothing, but later quietly he began answering questions. The Soviets spent 2 more weeks preparing. They installed Soviet avionics where American systems had been damaged. They jury-rigged fuel pumps. They studied the flight manual, translated into Russian by intelligence officers working around the clock, until they could recite procedures from memory. Wright was strapped into a jump seat behind the cockpit, watched by an armed guard. "This is insane," Wright muttered. Volkov ignored him. He ran through the checklist, his hands moving across the switches with surprising confidence. Around him, the cockpit came alive. Hydraulic systems whined, fuel pumps hummed, electrical systems buzzed. The 8 engines began their startup sequence, one by one, a symphony of thunder that shook the jungle. "Engines 1 through 8 operational," Kuznetsov reported. Volkov glanced at Wright. "Any final advice, Major?" Wright stared at him. Then, almost despite himself, he said, "Don't over-rotate on takeoff. She's tail-heavy without a full bomb load. And for God's sake, don't lose an engine on climb-out. You won't have enough power to recover." Volkov nodded. "Thank you." He pushed the throttles forward, the flight. The B-52 began to roll. Slowly at first, ponderously, like a sleeping giant waking. Then faster. The jungle blurred past. The nose lifted. The main gear followed. And suddenly, impossibly, the enormous bomber was airborne. Volkov felt his breath catch. The controls were heavy, hydraulically assisted but still requiring strength. The aircraft climbed sluggishly, each foot of altitude earned through sheer engine power. At 5,000 feet, he leveled off and exhaled. "We are flying," Kuznetsov said, disbelief in his voice. Volkov allowed himself a smile. "Yes, we are flying an American strategic bomber." For the next hour, they circled over North Vietnam, far from prying eyes, testing the aircraft. Volkov ran through basic maneuvers, banks, climbs, descents. The B-52 responded with ponderous grace, like a cargo ship navigating open ocean. It was not agile. It was not nimble. But it was steady, powerful, unstoppable. He tested the bombing radar. Even without live ordnance, the system worked. The radar painted the ground below with astonishing clarity. He could see roads, buildings, rivers. The computer calculated hypothetical bomb releases with precision. "This is how they destroy us," Volkov said quietly. "They do not see us. They do not need to see us. They see radar shadows and coordinates, and they drop bombs from 7 miles up." Wright, listening from the jump seat, said nothing, but his expression was grim. At one point, Volkov experimented with the autopilot, a system Soviet bombers lacked. He engaged it, and the aircraft flew itself, adjusting for wind, maintaining altitude, and heading without input. It was eerie, liberating, terrifying. "This is not a bomber," Volkov said. "This is a machine designed so that men become passengers. The aircraft does the thinking. The men simply monitor." Kuznetsov frowned. "Is that better?" Volkov didn't answer. After 2 hours, fuel running low, he turned back toward the airfield. The landing was tense. The B-52's approach speed was high, over 150 knots, and the runway was barely long enough. Volkov descended carefully, watching the altimeter, the airspeed, the angle of attack. At the last moment, he pulled the nose up, cut the throttles, and let the bomber settle onto the runway with a bone-jarring thud. They rolled to a stop. Silence. Then from the back of the cockpit, Wright spoke. "Not bad. For a Soviet." Volkov turned and looked at him. "Your aircraft is a masterpiece, Major, but it is a masterpiece built for a war that does not exist." Wright frowned. "What do you mean?" Your B-52 assumes everything will work, that you will have fuel, parts, trained crews, clear skies, and no opposition. Our bombers assume nothing will work, that we will have to fly through fire on one engine with half a crew. Your aircraft is perfect for peace. Ours is perfect for war. Wright stared at him. Then slowly, he nodded. Maybe you're right. The analysis. Over the following weeks, Volkov flew the B-52 7 more times. Each flight revealed new insights. He tested its maximum altitude, over 50,000 feet, higher than any Soviet bomber could reach. He tested its endurance, remaining airborne for over 6 hours without refueling. He tested its bombing accuracy, dropping practice ordnance with precision that Soviet systems could not match. But he also discovered its weaknesses. The aircraft was vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles. Its size made it easy to track on radar. Its complexity meant that mechanical failures cascaded rapidly. A single damaged hydraulic line could cripple the entire control system. A single failed engine could force an emergency landing. It is a weapon designed for a specific enemy, Volkov wrote in his classified report. An enemy without advanced air defenses, without interceptors, without the ability to fight back. Against such an enemy, the B-52 is invincible. Against a prepared enemy, it is a target. He compared it to Soviet bombers. The Tu-95 Bear was slower, less accurate, but could operate from rough airstrips, survive battle damage, and be maintained by conscripts with minimal training. The Tu-16 Badger was smaller, simpler, cheaper to build. The B-52 was magnificent, but fragile. The Americans, Volkov concluded, have built a weapon for the war they want. We have built weapons for the war we expect. His report reached Moscow in November 1972. It was read by military leaders, aircraft designers, and strategic planners. Some dismissed it. Others took it seriously. A few recognized it for what it was, a warning. The Americans, Volkov had written, believe technology can replace strategy. They believe complexity can replace resilience. They are wrong. In war, the simplest solution that works is always superior to the perfect solution that fails. The aftermath. The captured B-52 remained hidden in North Vietnam until the end of the war. After 1975, it was quietly dismantled and transported to the Soviet Union, where it was studied for years by aviation institutes and military researchers. Its radar systems influenced Soviet designs. Its bombing computers were reverse engineered. Its airframe was analyzed for weaknesses. But the greatest lesson was not technical, it was philosophical. Volkov, promoted to general after the war, gave a lecture at the Gagarin Air Force Academy in 1980. He spoke about the B-52. He showed photographs. He described the flight. And then he said, "The Americans built a god. We would have built a soldier. Gods are worshipped, but soldiers win wars." The room was silent. The B-52 was designed to be perfect, he continued, and because it was perfect, it required perfection from everything around it. Perfect fuel, perfect parts, perfect crews, perfect conditions. When those conditions existed, it was unstoppable. When they did not, it was helpless. He paused. We must never make that mistake. We must build weapons that work not when everything is right, but when everything is wrong. That is the only philosophy that survives war. Years later, after the Cold War ended, Volkov was interviewed by an American journalist researching the captured B-52. The journalist asked, "Do you think the B-52 was a good aircraft?" Volkov smiled. "It was a great aircraft, one of the greatest ever built." "Then why did you criticize it?" "Because greatness is not the same as effectiveness. The B-52 was built to impress. Soviet bombers were built to endure. In war, endurance wins." The journalist pressed, "But the B-52 is still flying today, decades later. Doesn't that prove its endurance?" Volkov's smile faded. "Yes, but only because America never faced an enemy that could truly test it. If they had, all those magnificent bombers would be wreckage." He looked out the window toward the sky. "I flew that aircraft. I felt its power. And I understood, for the first time, why America is both so strong and so fragile. Because they build perfection. And perfection cannot survive imperfection." Epilogue. The captured B-52 tail number 56-0676 was eventually destroyed. Officially, records state it was scrapped in 1982. Unofficially, pieces of it, engine components, avionics modules, radar parts, ended up in Soviet museums and research labs, silent testaments to one of the most bizarre episodes of the Cold War. Major Daniel Wright returned to the United States in 1973 as part of a prisoner exchange. He never spoke publicly about his time advising the Soviets. He retired from the Air Force in 1978 and died in 1995. Colonel Mikhail Volkov retired in 1985. He lived quietly in Moscow, writing occasional essays on military strategy and aviation history. When asked late in life what he remembered most about flying the B-52, he said, "The silence. When the engines were at cruise power, when the autopilot was engaged, when the systems were running smoothly, there was this silence. Not quiet, but silence. The absence of struggle. Everything worked so perfectly that it felt unreal. Like a dream." He paused. Soviet aircraft were never silent. They rattled. They shook. They demanded attention. The B-52 let you forget you were in a war machine. And that, I think, was the most dangerous thing about it. He looked up, eyes distant, remembering. "I flew a god, but I would rather fly a soldier." And with that, the last man to fly a stolen American B-52 turned away, leaving behind only questions, memories, and the enduring lesson that in the crucible of war, perfection is the first thing to burn.